This is We the Sales Engineers Podcast, show 169.
Welcome to We the SEs Podcast, the show for sales engineers by sales engineers with your host, Ramsey Marjaba.
What's up, SE family? Welcome back to another episode. I am your host, Ramsey Marjaba, here with my amazing co-host, Benny, who wants to spend his time outside, not inside, talking to me, Kunungo. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I mean, as well as anybody can be while staying inside right now.
Yeah.
No, I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day outside.
It is a beautiful day. And we had I was going to say a beautiful guest, but I don't think that's how I should word it. We had an amazing guest today. Or we will have an amazing guest. In case you're wondering, we record the outros after we do the interview because we don't know what to talk about. And in case you're ever going to be a guest on this show, we don't really prepare. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. Our guests seem to enjoy it because they don't have to worry about preparing for hours. And also it's a conversation versus anything else. And today we're going to talk about objection handling, which is, what do you think about objection handling, Benny?
I have no objections to it. I think it's a good concept. It's a great thing. I think it's good. It's difficult. Like, it's one of those things that I think before you know that it's a thing, it's such a, like, how do you get around an objection sometimes? And like, to know that there's like actual things and techniques and maybe methodologies that one could employ to get good at it is interesting.
Yeah. Well, I do want to point out that a lot of SEs think that objection handling is the salesperson's job. And what we talk about when you mentioned techniques today, there aren't really that many tricks, right? And it's not like, oh, if someone says this, you say that, and now you've overcome objection. No, the techniques are actually more human. And we're going to jump into that. And Doug does have a book called Win-Win Selling, which when we had this conversation a couple of days ago, I was on chapter 6. Now I'm on chapter 9. It's not a big book, right? It's a thin book, but it's all about objection handling. So if you're curious about that, and because it's something that SEs are never taught, right? We talk about, oh, you should do objection, you should handle objections, but how? So that's the book for you.
Amazing.
Yeah. Martin, let's just jump into the show because we talk about that book on the show.
Let's do it.
Good evening, Doug. How you doing?
I'm good, Ramsey. How are you doing today?
I'm good. This is pretty much the shortest conversation we've had before the podcast starts. So I'm sure, like, we've talked in the past, but I'm sure Benny's curious about who you are, and I'm sure the rest of the population might be as well. So who are you and what do you do?
Well, I was born a poor child in Mississippi. No, I'm just kidding. So who am I? Well, professionally, I'm a sales revenue growth expert, where I help companies increase their sales, solve the frustrations within their sales teams, and make everything optimized and run smoother. I mean, who am I as a person? I tend to think I'm a pretty good guy, actually. And I grew up in the world of selling. I grew up in family business, and I've applied a lot of what I've learned over the years, whether it's been the family business or large corporations I've worked with, into a concept of structuring and restructuring anyone's, sales revenue growth.
It's interesting you say you think you're a good person. Before I went into sales, I always, when someone said they're in sales, I'm like, okay, so you're a liar. But
Right.
Since I've been in sales, I've learned like some of the best salespeople they actually care and they're good people. Why do you think there is that misconception about salespeople in general?
I think in the history of sales, right? So if you come up all the way through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, even the 60s, I mean, the old Tin Man days of selling, where people would come in and basically manipulate and do whatever they can to make the sale. And then, you had the stereotypical used car sales guy type mentality, right? So I think a lot of people got used to being sold to versus having a sale, which is really a win-win concept. And the people selling, quite frankly, their only concern, or majority concern, was how much money they could put in their pockets. So I think that's really where a lot of the misconception comes from sales, is from history, still continuing forward.
this might be the most general question you've ever heard, but what can we as new generation of sales people and sales engineers do to improve that?
Well, communication's the key, right? I mean, selling is all about communication. The challenge is most human beings on this planet are not really good at communicating. They're good at communicating what their own wants and needs are, but they're not good at listening to other people's wants, needs, fears, frustrations. And behind every buyer or every buying decision, people think that people buy for professional ROIs, but they also buy for their own personal reasons. Behind every corporate buying decision is a personal agenda. And most of the time people in sales are not addressing that personal agenda. So therefore it's coming off like they're not genuinely interested in the other person. And sometimes they aren't, and sometimes they are. But either way, the perception is, hey, you don't care about me, you care about only making a sale.
I've seen kind of just in like short time in my short career, I suppose, but it seems as if a lot of buyers come in with that perception already in mind of the fact that the salesperson is going to be kind of that scum. I'm going to take this as poorly as I possibly can, but like it's kind of that scummy, like sleazy person that's here to swindle a deal out of me and all that. But I found and I've been super privileged with just about every single rep I've had the opportunity to work with so far. They've very much just been very genuine people that I think, to your point, we're very good at communicating kind of their side of things, but also relatively transparent too with respect to kind of what the buyer may expect out of the market, not even necessarily just boosting ourselves, but also kind of talking about the strengths of the competitors that they'll face out there, or rather that we'd be facing and that they'll be speaking to in the future as well. And kind of that genuine transparency or genuine, I don't know, intent to do what's best for the buyer is something that I've seen to do very well, I guess, for these salespeople, because it kind of like throws that perception right out of the window right away for that buyer, where they're like, oh, wow, this is actually a real good person who's really here for my best interests.
Yeah, I mean, you just get, even though, the past history is dictated, there are still people who still subscribe to that model, right? Through ignorance or whatever in their selling capacity. And they come off as that person that you guys were just describing, scummy is a good word for it, right? And there still are people out there that do that. I find a lot of it is in the training of the individual when they learn how to sell, or lack of training, they don't know how to sell. They're tasked with a quota, so they're going to do anything they can to actually keep the job and keep the money flowing in. And so if somebody comes in with full transparency, I am who I am. And if we got outside this podcast and, we were in a selling situation, I'm the same guy there. If we were, hanging out, having dinner together, I'm the same guy there. Because it's really important. People, the old rapport, right? Like, trust, respect. Well, the moment that somebody senses that there's not transparency, they're going to then throw the flag up and say, okay, I don't trust this person as much. I don't like this person as much. And I don't respect this person as much. So might as well come in being who you are. And not every sale is going to close, but the majority of those will, and the ones that close because we're being transparent will be much better sales than if we weren't.
That's so true. It really kind of resonates with something that we had a recent guest come on who I believe was a national director, and correct me if I'm wrong there, Ramsey, but national director of solutions engineering at VMware. Relatively recent show, I think, just released this week actually. And anyways, he was talking about how just for people in general, that their reputation, it's their reputation, it's their personal reputation, not that of the company. Companies change all the time, and kind of putting aside your values or who you are for the sake of a company that is super temporary, whereas you are you and will always be you, isn't the wisest thing to do. So kind of stay true to yourself and recognize that your actions kind of reflect on you yourself as a person, not necessarily your company.
Oh, without question, because buyers move from company to company too. So if the selling party moves from company A to company B, and the buyer now is looking at company B, but they bought from company A and the result wasn't good because of that lack of transparency, then they're not going to want to do business with the company B because of that same reason.
100% agreed.
So you were talking about it's about training and all that. I've seen people, I've worked with maybe 5 or 6 different salespeople since I became a sales engineer, and 5 of them were great people. One, and I've talked about him at length, he would actually lie to the customers to get a sale. So it's not just about training. It's He would take a PO in for a product that's like support for a product that's obsolete, even though it's obsolete. We're not going to support it no matter what. He just like, oh, it's free money for him. So yeah, there's some stuff about training, but there's also some bad apples that are out there.
Well, without question, in any industry, though, I mean, you have doctors that are, accused of sexual harassment. You have attorneys. I mean, you look at everything that's happened in Hollywood recently, right? So, I mean, it doesn't matter what industry it's in. There are, like you said, maybe it's one out of whatever.
Yeah, well, even customers too. Like some customers want you to take them out for like $2,000 worth of drink, so they buy from you. So it's like it goes, I guess, in all different directions. There's something you just mentioned though, like when I'm trying to sell to a company, I'm trying to solve their business problem. You mentioned something about like people have their own agendas of why they want to buy as well. I don't really consider that as a sales engineer. I'm just trying to solve a business problem. So
Right.
How could we actually pull out that information? Like, why is someone even? What's the criteria for that person to satisfy that person specifically?
Well, I think you asked the perfect question, right? What is the specific criteria that this person's looking for? Why are they thinking this way? What are they going? Because when you look at somebody's, let's say as a sales engineer, which I've worked with, lots of sales engineers, the salesperson comes in or the sales team comes in, they sell something, and then I'll just say it the way it is. They dump it on the sales engineers, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times, right? So if the salesperson hasn't set that frame appropriately up front, then you're going to run into a situation where you got to kind of figure out what's going on the back end, which isn't fair to the sales engineer at all. I've always brought sales engineers into most of the deals that I've done at the buying time so that they can actually meet the buyer and they understand what's going on. But you said the exact perfect words, which is, let's get curious about what's making this person think the way they're thinking and what made them buy. It's a great question to ask them. Hey, look, I'm your sales engineer and I'm just curious, what were the, top 3 or 4 things that, you saw here that had you do business with us? And they'll start to tell you, and then you can ask and dig a little bit more, with open-ended questions, and then what we want to do is we want to equate whatever they're saying to something that's a personal value. So if they go, I bought, the old adage, you never go wrong buying an IBM, right? Why? Job security.
Yeah.
Right. So if you get job security, what does that give a person on personal ROI? That gives them a stable family life. If they have a family, it gives them the ability to have greater repute within the company. There's all these personal things that people look at, but most salespeople, not all, but most salespeople miss these things. And therefore they're either missing sales or they're selling in my opinion, the wrong way. Because we sell to people, not to titles or entities, right? They're just people who hold those titles.
That's true. Do you find it's changing? Has that been something that you think has been getting better over time, at least?
I think with the pandemic and COVID-19 and the way things have played, it's actually driven more on the personal level now than it was in the past.
Okay.
And, the other thing that's really changed things is the internet, right? Because the information that, when I was growing up, if you wanted to buy an automobile, for example, you had maybe 3-4 dealerships in the area of 50 miles, right? Okay. And so you go in there and they play the game and they bring you back in that little room and they try to, do whatever they were going to do back then. Today, heck, last time I talked, 72% of leads, to auto dealerships, 72% of their leads were coming in first as an online lead inquiry. Yep. So a person can go up there and a few clicks of a mouse, they can find more about the automobile than the actual salesperson that's selling. And I just had this recently, Benny, happen to me where I was buying a new car and I'm walking in and I'm saying, oh, here's the model I want. I said, does it come with heated and cooled seats? The heat and cool at the same time. And he goes, well, I don't know. Right. And it's like, and so I would ask him a couple other questions. Well, do you change the oil every X, miles, based on the fact that this is this type of engine? And he goes, I don't know. Right. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, now I'm becoming the salesperson. But the reality is I knew more about the vehicle that I actually did purchase than they do, because I was able to go look it all up. I can tell what kind of pricing they had, all kinds of things, and dealer incentives, anything.
That's such a good point. Yeah, the whole idea about, I think we've talked about it before on the show with it. Sorry, Ramsey, I feel like I'm jumping in too much,
No,
but
go ahead.
this last point, I guess, that idea of like buyers coming in more prepared than ever before, and just in general across industries is so true. And so you're right. I mean, if you just take the most human approach to it, also, you're competent enough to at least sell the value of your product, but everybody will kind of probably be at least at that level. And it's probably fair to say that they'll have at least the same, like they'll be able to do whatever research they need to do to get that technical competence themselves. This is the buyer for whatever product you're selling. So yeah, you're right. That's a really good insight. Just be the most human, all else remaining the same, and things should go pretty well.
Yeah, and as a salesperson, if you're selling, I mean, if they got guys like you, highly skilled technical sales engineers on the back end, you can be more human than ever, because the reality is you don't have to be know everything as a salesperson if you have the resources to do it. I was just having this conversation earlier today with one of my clients, and they're selling. I did an investigative process on there, and they're selling on product data. They're trying to sell on product. And so I've had to explain to them that, look, that is one facet of what people look at, but let's talk about how to sell on value, and the value that the person who's buying is actually looking for. And so, they took it very well. Not everybody does, because they don't understand that, but it's certainly, we're not buying from anybody but human beings who have wants, needs, desires, fears, just like the rest of us in the world.
So right now, like you mentioned, that people are getting more into the sales cycle before actually engaging the sales team. But also, it used to be like one person make a decision. Now it's like you have to go through a committee of people who actually make a decision. Do we have to consider every single person's fears? And like, I'm not a lovey-dovey guy, so I don't really care if you're afraid. What did I do?
But no, I mean, but you're a nice guy, right? So you don't, it's not like we're going to go, light a campfire and hang around and hold hands. You don't have to do that type of thing and sing camp songs, right? But what we want to do is, and the answer to your question is yes, right? See, you guys have an advantage. You know how a sales engineer thinks, or an engineer in a company would think. So when you come in there, you can bring that level of expertise. One of the big mistakes when people are selling larger accounts today is they're not selling peer to peer, right? So, if a sales manager and two sales guys walks in and they're going to be talking to, 3 or 4 other people, immediately the CEO is probably going to go, okay, 2 liars and 1 potential liar that I'm talking with, right? That's what's going to probably go through the head. But if I come in with a sales engineering team, and let's say they bring human resources into the meeting, and I bring our HR person, and they bring their chief financial officer, and I bring a financial officer into the company. Now we're on peer to peer. So the questions that are going to be asked are going to now line up. And that's where a lot of, like, if they're selling, enterprise accounts or large accounts, that's the challenge that most people have.
Yeah, I noticed a lot of engineers tend to hate to talk to salespeople.
Sure.
But those same engineers would talk to sales, like even though sales is in the title, they would talk to sales engineers just because there's the word engineer at the end of it.
Of course.
Yeah, so it's that's what I think, there's a lot of value to sales engineers there, because if the sales engineer has the sales skills, which we're going to talk about, well, specifically one of them right now, they can add a lot of value to the sales process, not just to the answering the technical questions.
A salesperson selling without using the team behind them, especially the sales engineers, is a fool, because you gentlemen and ladies who are sales engineers bring a whole different thought process to the game than most salespeople. You're much more pragmatic. You're able to talk the talk, right? And most engineers by nature are methodical. They're very highly methodical type people. And so on sales engineers, right? And just because you have the title, I had a guy that I used to work with when I was selling telecommunication services. on the enterprise level. His name was Peter Weston. I would drag Peter everywhere with me, but I was the number one rep out of 320 people in the company. And so, there was a reason for that, because I didn't know a lot of stuff he was even talking about at the time when he would start talking about the engineering side of it. So I was learning from that process. But what I did know how to do was build that human relationship.
So you wrote a book, which I'm going to show here for those who watch it on YouTube, Win-Win Selling.
Mhm.
And it's mostly about handling objections.
Yes.
So how about, let's start with the basic of the basics. Like, hopefully everybody should already know the answer to this, but can you define objections from your lens?
From my lens, an objection is a statement or behavior that somebody displays to some discomfort that happened in the conversation, usually, or prior even to the conversation. So really, all objections stem from fear or some level of being uncomfortable. And, so a person then espouses something, usually in an emotional manner, or says something in a context, but it's not really the real thing most of the time. It's they're protecting themselves. And the reason so they're protecting themselves is because they feel that something could hurt them in this conversation. And so therefore they object. And, it's up to us to figure out what that objection really means.
So in my experience working with SEs, and you can tell me about salespeople in general, the first thing that SEs or some SEs do when they hear an objection is get defensive and
Right.
start arguing. Do you see that with salespeople as well? Is it a common trait amongst salespeople?
Yeah, it's a common trait with people in general, right? So it's, whether we label sales engineers or salespeople or, I don't know, dentist or whatever, right? It's a human trait. And, most people were brought up in environments where if they got something wrong, they were berated for it, right? So, parents would scold them, or somebody would say, no, that's wrong. You're not supposed to think this way, or whatever. And, we come along as human beings because we learn objections from our very early age up, from the people that actually we hang around with, right? Or hung around with in that capacity. So, yeah, I mean, an objection is nothing more than an expression. And sales engineers will dig in because most of the time, the ones I've actually asked about this, they feel they were being attacked or they didn't quite know something. So it's a very easy thing to go on the attack. Therefore, we're deflecting what the real issue is, which is, hey, I may not even know the answer to that question, right?
What should we do instead, other than read your book?
Read the book. No, so, look, I've sold on, I mean, Intuit's my client, Procter & Gamble, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, CBS Television, on those levels. And I've sold on all kinds of levels in between, startup companies all the way to, multi-million-dollar deals. And everything has been consistent across the board. Human beings are human beings, and it does not matter what they're in. So the first thing, if they do read the book, the first rule of objections is take a breath and relax.
Yep. Chapter
Okay?
6.
Chapter 6. Thank you.
Yep.
And the reason I put that in there is because the people who have read this book have actually come back to me and said, geez, my God, I never even thought of that. Right. But, we get an impulse that comes in and we quickly discern whether it is good for us or bad for us. And that's a survival mechanism. So most people, when they come in, the challenge is they've been running this pattern in their head and in their life, and they've created these emotional habits. And that habit is to defend myself. I'm going to play defense. So the second rule is, after relax and take a breath, is get curious, not confrontational. Right? So, excuse me. So if we get curious, then we have to look at things like, if you guys have ever seen a little child, a butterfly lands or whatever, and they pick they got the butterfly on their hand or whatever, they look at this thing in wonderment. They're like, how does this thing work? What is it thinking? All of those things. And this, on the sales side, when we get an objection, is what we should be doing, because behind every objection is what I call the real it, the real reason that people are actually objecting. So we must get to the real it, or we'll be chasing, the rabbit around the yard, trying to get him back into the pen. And that's not going to work most of the time.
I like that. So the way I see it, like getting defensive or starting playing defense or going on the attack would imply that you and your customers are on two different teams.
Yep.
Whereas the whole point of what we're trying to be is on the same team. So how can we be on the same team if we're just fighting with them?
Well, we won't. I mean, unless they're that personality that gets a lot of pleasure out of having a fight, which is not most people, then, look, they're objecting. Think about it. Fear comes up. Oh my gosh, they throw out an objection. Now the sales engineer goes, oh yeah, right? and now they're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So now the person who's objecting is feeling attacked. So now more fear kicks in. And so what ends up happening is that person who's receiving these attacks is kicking in and saying, okay, now I need to defend myself. And it now becomes not about what the objection was or is. It now becomes about this person is now making me feel more uncomfortable, as you were just saying. And guess what? Even worse in the sales. Now it's not about the objection. It's about that dirty, rotten rat who made me feel like I had to defend myself. And now we've got a second objection introduced into the situation, which is a personal conflict.
Yeah. Also, like one thing I see is a lot of objections are sometimes just misunderstanding. Either they misunderstood what we're saying, or what they're doing is not even an objection. So, and I've seen that where it plays out where they start going back and forth. And if, like, I'm usually the bystander, so I jump in and I just say, to the customer, are you saying this? They're like, yeah. And you can feel the release.
Exactly.
And you can feel the release from my my colleagues. Oh, it's like, oh yeah, we're talking about the same thing. Yeah, we can do that, obviously.
Right.
So like, I would say like stopping to breathe would actually allow you to try to understand them a little bit better as well. Because
without question, and then getting curious, you start asking different types of questions of curiosity versus directive type questions. And by the way, folks, this works great between interpersonal relationships. Take it from me. I've learned how to, my wife asked me certain things and all of a sudden I'm like, you got to be kidding me, right? That's the first thing that kicks into my head. Then I go, take a breath, relax, get curious. Why is she possibly thinking this way? What might be causing her to say this? And so then I start going into the other parts of the formula, which are, okay, let's think before we speak, and let's now ask questions of curiosity. And the moment I do that, she starts, settling down, right? And things. And, because the other thing is especially when you're dealing with different genders or different buying personas, sometimes certain personas just want to be heard. That's the reason they're saying this, right? And so, take a woman, a lot of times they just want to be heard. And we as men are so solution oriented that we just try to go in and fix the problem. Well, they don't want us to fix the problem. That's not the personal agenda behind the motive to buy. What they want us to do is listen to them so they can get out what they want to get out. And then they feel better about us. And guess what? You'll get more sales.
Nice. Any other rules? You go ahead, Benny. You had a question?
Oh no, I mean, truly, like, I just said something just to kind of, because I haven't said anything for a while and I felt really bad about it. This is amazing, just kind of taking this all in. But it makes perfect sense too. And like that whole idea about, your work, like you're an individual working for a company, that uncomfortable feeling you may feel kind of, I don't know what the right word for it is offhand, but I guess handling an objection or objection handling, or kind of countering back with a question or whatever it may be, kind of to dig down to find out what that actual it factor is.
Mm-hmm.
At first always seemed like a very uncomfortable concept to kind of challenge the customer to kind of, ask them more about that objection. But realistically, like, it isn't so bad when you frame it under the idea of just wanting to find out more so that you're better able to help them. So you could truly make sure you're addressing their objection or addressing their question or their concern, where, if you just hear a statement, it might come from some direction you're not really, I guess, perceiving it to, or I don't really know what I'm trying to say from that, but yeah, asking questions is amazing, and don't feel bad about it, I suppose. So
no, and those who are uncomfortable about it, Benny, one of the greatest things that you can do is compliment the person right up front. I've had people say things in sales, situations where I go and I pause and I go, you know what? I really want to thank you for bringing that forward. Thank you for having the courage and the trust in me to actually give me the real information. So we're not going down a path enthusiastically thinking we're going down the right path and I'm not understanding. I really appreciate your professionalism.
It's a great tip. Yeah.
Right. So as soon as you compliment that person, they're going to feel good. So now they're going to be open now to more conversation, especially if it's not an interrogation. You know, geez, Benny, I'm curious, you said this, and you know, a lot of times I've heard that and it either means X, Y, or Z, but not all the time. Could you explain to me what it means to you? Right?
Right. Yeah.
And now you're able to tell me what's going on. And I might ask a couple other questions around that. I keep, you know, I have a formula in there, you know, QQQARQR, right? So it's about asking question, giving rewards, giving answers, asking questions, you know, resolving this for them. The problem is in sales that people are too much in a rush to consummate the deal. They want the ink on the paper, which is important, but not everybody moves at the same speed. And buyers want to feel confident. And quite frankly, they have more choices than ever today to buy from most industries. They don't even need someone to talk to. Sometimes they can just go up online and get it, right? And so if we're going to want to win more sales, we must look at the personal agenda of the person who's objecting and get curious on that and figure it out, because they have a professional, you know, ROI in their head, but that personal objective usually is what they're objecting over, because that need, that human need for them is not met.
Amazing. I love also that whole idea about just like, I guess, how they feel, or to kind of, rather, you mentioned feel a few times in there, and how a customer feels in the end, you know, regardless of if the solution is the best or not. I guess that's how they feel about the sales rep, about the overall interaction, about how much trust they feel, I suppose, with the vendor they're speaking to is going to make it's going to be a huge contributing factor to their buying decision. And yeah, if you kind of show that maybe you might not have all the answers, but you make them feel comfortable and you make them feel like you can get those one way or another, or even if you have objections, you, like you said, you know, you make the buyer feel heard. Yeah, it's going to go a long way. So yeah, I love that quite a lot.
I've made sales with inferior product.
Fair,
you know,
I believe it, yeah.
Because of the relationship, right? People are like going, yeah, you know what? I don't really need those heated seats, you know, it'd be nice to have, but it's not a necessity. I'd rather deal with somebody I know has my back.
Right.
Right. And so I'm not saying that, you know, we have to be such a social animal that we forget about the objective of the business. I'm saying if we equal prioritize in most capacities, those two things, or we ask the questions and we understand that the professional return on investment is much more important to the person than the personal, and not forget it, then we can skew the conversation to hit what they're looking for.
True.
I just want to add a comment, like about like Benny, you mentioned about like being afraid to dig in deeper about a certain objection. When we just met before Doug joined us, you asked me how I'm doing, and I said I'm a little frustrated. Your reaction was, "What's going on?" Right? It shows that you care. And like me saying I'm frustrated, that was an objection. And the same thing with a customer. If they're objecting about something and you're digging deeper, it shows that you care. You're not just pushing their objection aside and moving on to the next topic, or just trying to fight with them over the objection. So caring, I guess, is a big part of that, even if you don't want to be a social animal.
True. And even just to piggyback off that, the whole idea about, like, if you have an objection kind of given to you, instead of just kind of like or rather having a response right out of your back pocket to objection handle, I suppose, which is maybe a cookie cutter response, kind of asking more questions to kind of understand where that objection is coming from. And perhaps you then end up with that same canned response at the end of it all, but just kind of, you know, that display of inquisitiveness or display of care just by asking more about where that specific objection is coming from. Even if it is a super generic one in the end. Yeah, you're right. I guess that does go a really long way, and really can, rather, that showing of care can go quite a long way.
And that canned objection you're talking about, if it's used up front, might actually drive more fear into the situation. You know, somebody says, well, I just can't, you know, I don't have the budget for this. Did I just hear you didn't say the budget? You don't have a budget for this? Right. And depending on the tone of the person, did I just hear you don't have a budget for this?
Sure.
Right? It's like condescending. But if you got through the whole process of what we're talking about, and then you ask the question, gee, sir, I just wanted to reiterate, did I understand correctly that said you didn't have the budget for this? They're going to take it in a whole different context.
So true.
And that's really, again, sales, win-win selling is all about communication, because they're looking for them to win, but they're not looking for the salesperson most of the time to lose either. And that's part of the positioning the salesperson has to understand.
Totally. I just had a revelation, which I'm sure was probably all done by design, not like my revelation, but rather like the name win-win selling and all that. And I'm just kind of green and dumb. But what it was essentially was back in school, way back when, in an organizational behavior class, we had a little exercise around teaching students, all learning, I guess, rather about negotiations. And I won't go through the whole exercise per se, but it had to do with, split into two different teams and little groups or whatever. One team in some fictional scenario needed the rind of an orange, and the other team needed the flesh of the orange. And there's a limited supply of oranges, and you have to kind of go up against each other, to get whatever you need for your own mandate, not knowing necessarily that you only needed one part of the orange and the other team needed the other. And so by the end of the exercise, every single team mostly would either split the oranges 50-50. Oh, by the way, both teams needed to have, let's say, the whole crop, or I guess, let's say if there's 100 oranges, they needed to have 100 rinds and 100, I guess, flesh parts to achieve their goal. So they try to split things. Some people might try to do like a time thing where I'll give some of the oranges or whatever for the first part, and then give whatever's left to the other team after that. Where the actual best solution was just the idea of, we actually talked about it. We communicated the fact that, we only needed the rinds and you only need the flesh parts. And then, the win-win scenario was the one where both teams go out with the parts of the oranges that they needed most. And very few teams ever came to that win-win solution, because I guess so few teams actually communicated. And the whole idea of your book being called Win-Win Selling, and a large part of that just being around the communication of things is so perfect, I think, just after that whole experience.
Well, thank you. And, I didn't make the name up. There was a book called Win-Win Selling before mine, but it was, Win-Win Selling, Unlocking the Power of Profitability by Resolving Objections, because we must sell win-win, especially today. I mean, 2021 and beyond, you got to sell win-win in this thing, or because buyers have too many choices now in the internet in time. I think with what's happened, it's going to make sales channels a little more obsolete, right? When it comes down to it. And it's, not put them out for sure, because people are always going to, but it's going to allow people to continue to have more choices than ever. And, using things like video conferencing and things like that people are using today. I mean, they don't even call it video conferencing more, and they call it Zooming, right? All these things, these technologies are just making people's access to information far more easier than it was in the past. And this is how a sales channel we have to shift. And, those of people that might be listening going, oh, okay, that's cool. I want to hire salespeople. We can assess this too. We can assess whether or not the person's going to be that person, like you said, Ramsey, early on, where they're just going to immediately push back, right? We can assess that going on and say, okay, that's not the type of representation we want in the field, or it's a training issue that we can train that out. But if it's a personality thing that's going on, or the salesperson doesn't have the right sales DNA to, have the will to sell, to go through that process of asking inquisitive questions to get to the root cause of the challenge, well, all that could be assessed. So that, even technology has made that easier. So right. All of this kind of plays in. And that's why I knew the past book was called Win-Win Selling. I didn't want to confuse it. So that's why I gave it the longer title, but I did want to keep win-win in there, because that's all that I teach. And that's all that I play by.
So we covered around 4 rules of objection handling. There's 5 more. We're not going to talk about them right now, because if people want to learn more, they should get the book. You're not paying me to say this. I've read 6 chapters so far, and I've enjoyed it.
Sure, I will pay you to say more if you want, but no.
We're good. I recommend good books when there are good books. But I this podcast is kind of targeted towards sales engineers, And generally speaking, the first comment that sales engineers say when they talk about objection handling is like, oh, that's something the salesperson does. What is the role of the sales engineer in objection handling?
Well, it depends on, there's a couple different roles. Number one, it's not just sales support. It really, when it comes down to it, the sales engineer is the reason that people buy. They might like the salesperson, but when they engage with the sales engineer, you're the installation component of this. You are the, I'll take it in telecommunications, for example. The number one fear that people had in doing telecommunications purchases, I used to sell dial tone, data services, things like that. The number one concern they had was not whether they can reduce their phone bills or not. The number one concern is, will I be knocked out of service? And therefore, I am going to have hell on earth, excuse my language on your podcast,
All good.
from my CEO and my executive team, or the president of the division or whatever. And so they're very cautious. Now that sales engineer can come in and speak with their technical people or even that individual and say, look, we have a process here, and let me explain the process in the way that they would understand it. I used to work with a lot of people selling in IT space, and the same thing, or engineering companies. I had this rather large company they sold off. It was called Edwards and Kelsey, right? I mean, they were all engineers. I can think a little bit methodically, but you know what? I brought my engineering team in. I brought the CEO. I brought all these people in to meet their people because they were a huge company for the engineering space, and they had lots of reach. And so I think the role of the sales engineer is twofold. Number one, to understand that they're not just a support role, that they're part of the sale. They are an equal part of the sale, and that people rely upon them for their expertise. And so people want to be able to communicate with them on that level so that they feel safe in the purchasing decision. And I think the second role of the sales engineer is actually to help lead the salesperson in many cases, because the salesperson by nature, they're a fish on a line, they're going all over the place. And the sales engineer is trying to put process and methodical, sanity to the process, right? There were many days that Peter Weston came out of his office, and I won't repeat the words he was using coming down the hallway after I sold something, but I sold something that didn't exist to 5 major clients, and we had to develop it, right? So he was like not a happy dude with me.
Yeah.
Right? But they made it a mainstay product and made tens of millions of dollars off this after I was done with it. But selling it the first time. But I knew Peter's position, and Peter's was tasked, right? And so Peter, I used him and the other sales engineers as part of the team. And I think that's why we got along so well as well, because, most salespeople don't understand how sales engineers think. And they certainly don't have the technical acumen that the sales engineer has. So the sales engineer is part of the sale as much as any other part of the sale that happens, whether it's, operations or provisioning or customer service or whatever it might be. The sales engineer, if they take that role and they take a more proactive role on that, firstly, the client's going to love them more. And secondly, the engineer is going to have a much easier time, because when something goes wrong, and inevitably in technology or so it will, yep, the client's not going to be coming out of their chair they're going to understand, because they relate to the sales engineer and what the sales engineer is going through.
That's pretty cool. I like that you said the sales engineer is the reason people buy. That made me happy. Thank you for that.
I mean, look, if the salesperson doesn't have the answers, the sales engineer is the glue that puts this all together, right? And puts I always tell people, like when you call into any type of service-based company, let's say, I don't know, your data goes down in, I don't know, AT&T or whoever you got, at the time. Those people on that front end, if they're on the engineering or technical side, or they're even on the customer service side, they're expecting clients to be, not so nice. They're expecting them to go, oh, well, they're going to come in. So I always teach people, I said, look, if you want to get anything done within an organization, tell them right up front, listen, I suspect you get a lot of calls where people are irate and they're not treating you well. I promise you, I'm not going to be that type of person, because I understand that on your side, you're just trying to help me. And then there's some issue going on. It's not your fault. You just came to work today. It's not my fault. I purchased. Something's messed up. You think we could help each other? And I will tell you, doing that over and over again with any type of sales engineering or any type of engineering buying decision, people love that, because most people are so used to defending themselves, like you said, Ramsey, in the beginning. And now they realize, okay, wait a minute, this person actually has my better day in mind. And therefore we become people. And it's like kids, you give 5 little kids, 2, 3 years old, an ice cream, you put one ice cream in there, they'll all share it.
Yeah.
But as soon as
Not
somebody
my
tries
kids,
to,
but yeah.
not your kids, but most kids will, and it doesn't matter whether it's different genders, different races, different, whatever, language barriers, they're just kids. And we're all big kids that are just in a bigger body. That's all really when it comes down to it.
So we do have to move on to the not so fire round. We might have to do it in a fire round succession, but before we go, you wrote something in your book that people may like you, but may not trust you. But how is that possible? How could people like someone and not trust them?
Well, we all buy from people that, we prefer to trust people, and we prefer to like people, and we prefer to respect them, right? But, we all buy from people that we don't like. I mean, you ever gone in, had a bad meal or a bad experience with somebody who's, brought your food to the table and you still paid the bill, right? So people may not necessarily, they may like you, but they may not trust you. And that's, think about it in the terms, I always relate back to human relationships, right? You might like somebody, you might like the gal might like the guy, or the guy might like the guy, or the gal might like the gal. But the bottom line is, if there's something that their radar goes up and goes, whoa, wait a minute, I like this person, but I heard them talk to their friend or their sister this way, and, I'm not going to be treated that way. So you might still like the person, but you don't trust them at that point. And that happens in sales all the time, especially when salespeople, get flippant, and, they're just trying to crush the sale. They're trying to crush the objection. They may still like the salesperson, but they don't trust them anymore. So therefore rapport is breaking down.
I never thought of that. Like, yeah. For me, I just linked the two together. So it's interesting to hear. There are situations where you kind of like the person in spite of hearing bad stuff about them, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look at our politicians. I mean,
I've never liked one. I've yet to like one. Right. So it is time to move on to the not so fire round. These are the same 4 questions we ask almost every guest, and we'd like to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Is this a test? I just want to know before we go.
Well, there is no pass or fail criteria. It's all
okay,
pass,
good.
no matter what you say.
All right.
Go ahead, Benny.
All right. So the very first one, toughest question. It's really not. What do you love about sales in general?
I love that it's one of the most leveraged activities where you can morally help people, and you can do it in a way that actually enhances someone's life. The fact is that a salesperson can truly change someone's life for the better. We can also change it for the worse too. So I love the fact that I can help people and move them forward. And, I've made sales that are allowed, them to go out and hire 20, 30, 40 other people. Right. And so now more families are being fed and all of that. So to me, sales is one of the most noble professions when done right, as any other profession out there. And it gives us great leverage. I mean, we can make great money selling, in the same amount of time that others who are trading time for, money, which is not a bad thing, but it's just the leverage component of it. I love that.
What an amazing way to look at it. But you're totally right. I like a lot about that. That's awesome.
Thank you.
All right.
I passed question 1, I guess. All right. That's cool.
Actually, you passed it with flying colors. I don't think anyone's answered that before. So on the flip side, is there something you would change about the role
Of sales?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I necessarily would change the role. I think I would change the reward system on not only just, you sell something, you get a commission, but how does the salesperson expand the sale? right? So a lot of times when I help companies set up, comp plans, I'm like, you have no referral system, right? So therefore you're spending, let's say an average client costs $3,000 to get. Every client, you got a $3,000, thing. But if you got a robust referral thing going on and you sell 100 clients a month, well, it's 3,000 times 100, 300 grand. That makes a difference in the bottom line profitability. So I wouldn't necessarily change the role of a salesperson, but I would change and reward them based on how they expand the sale and get more new clients and more upsells and more cross-sell opportunities. I would reward people because the more that people buy, generally, the more that they're ingrained and trust the company and stay with them long term.
Nice.
Yeah, sounds like a pass as well.
Oh, hey, I'm 50% so far. Okay.
This one might be a trick question, but no. So besides your own, and we'll have a link to your book in our show notes for this particular show, but what are some great books, tools, or other resources maybe you recommend to people that maybe either want to improve their way of doing sales or just maybe just get a different mindset on it? Because I know you've certainly shifted mine.
Yeah, one of the best books that and I know the person who wrote this book, his name is Mr. Russ Whitney. It's called Inner Voice, INNERVOICE. Now, Inner Voice is an interesting book because Russ had $1 billion worth of companies and he lost the majority of it overnight and had to rebuild, right? And but what it does is it goes in. See, the thing about sales is it's like anything, mind set or mind behind the actual event. If we're going to be a top professional athlete, if we get our confidence rocked or whatever, we're not so much of a top professional athlete when it comes to crunch time. So the same thing in sales. And Inner Voice just has a way of laying it all out from a business perspective in exercises and challenges to allow the person to kind of understand what the underpinnings of them wanting to fight if they're a sales engineer, for example, or whatever they're doing in the objection. So that's one of the books that I really recommend. I recommend, no matter what, if people are in sales, to find people who are doing what they want to do and model that, because get coaching, get help, because it cuts years off the learning curve. And, I helped a sales guy the other last year. He's doing $140,000 in commissions. And, we worked together for 4 months and he did 2.1 million in commissions that year, because he was just missing a few things that we were able to fill in. And when he did that, all of a sudden his sales started skyrocketing. So I think that would be the other advice I would give them, Benny, is model the best. And then when you model it, become the best student of that person that they've ever had. Be the number one and learn and absorb everything that you could possibly do. And I still do that today. I mean, I'm constantly investing, in mentors and coaches and things like that, and constantly listening to their recommendations on what to read and absorb as well.
Sorry, I can't unmute myself right after. Yeah, great advice. That's amazing. Thank you.
Can you share one thing that person was missing that he or she were able to change? And
yeah, I can say, because he told me this. There's an exercise that I do a lot with salespeople, and the guy was lying left and right. He was saying anything he could to make a sale. So I taught him about how to do this with integrity and not feel like he had to lie in order to gain respect. He was one of those guys that came from an environment, and this is what happens in objections. This is what happens in sales. He comes from an environment where, he had to constantly prove himself. Otherwise, he was deemed not worthy. So when somebody would say something, if he didn't know what the expertise, was needed for that, he would just start making it up. And it's funny, I had him do an exercise and he said, and I had him count him, and he's like, I lied 147 times this week.
wow.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
So if clients catch people in a selling and a lie, I mean, immediately that's a big break in trust. So as soon as we got past that, we started working on some other things, but that was the first thing that I went after.
I'm surprised that he was making 140K in commission while having that habit. So,
well, yeah, but a lot of people, can sell something if people believe in it. He was very credible in his belief. I mean, And not to bring a negative in, but look at Adolf Hitler. I mean, he swayed a whole country, and then part of the whole part of Europe, right? I mean, the guy to me was a liar. Right?
Yeah.
But people who are charismatic sometimes can do that and get away with it.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to judge or anything. I was just surprised about the fact that that was possible. But I guess, yeah, that works. All right, question number 4. Last question of the not so fi round. Is there a habit that you're trying to make or break at this point in time? And if yes, what would it be?
Wow, that one's a good one. 75%. So let's see if I can get the answer right on this one. For me, it's really more of a health habit at this point, right? I mean, I'm not overweight. But I'm not taking care of myself like I used to. And, the old adage, if you don't have your health, you really don't have anything.
Yeah.
It's so important in business and life in general. So yeah, that's a habit right now. Like I'll fool myself and say, hey, I'm a little stressed out, so let me go grab some chocolate or something like that. When I know that's not what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But on the business side, the habit that I would improve today is, well, I would hire somebody in to do this at this point for me and with me, but, a bit more on the organization side, because I'm always constantly looking for the leverage. How do you gain leverage? And I used to be one of those guys that was like, okay, well, I know people can do it other than me, but I've got to review everything and I've got to put my stamp of approval on everything. And so I've, that habit of letting go, I've been much better at that. And I still have a ways to go on that as well.
There's a book called Who Not How. Have you heard of it or seen it?
I haven't. What's it about?
I haven't read it, but ever since I heard the title, I try to implement it at my job, and it always ends up to be the who ends up being me. So that's another thing that I need to work on, it seems. All right. Last question of the day, Doug. If people want to reach out and learn more about you and get your coaching services or anything else that you offer, where can they do that?
Well, they can go to businesssuccessfactors.com, the website, and check out things there. They can go to, my LinkedIn profile is Doug Brown 1234, and they can certainly send me an email at doug@businesssuccessfactors.com, or just call us at 603-595-0303. They want a copy of the book, they can go to winwinsellingbook.com, and that will pick them up. Can I give a gift away to your audience?
Yeah.
Okay, so if they go to businesssuccessfactors.com/checklist, I have a sales and marketing checklist for people. If somebody's selling or somebody's an entrepreneur in some capacity, they can take this. It's kind of a self-audit, and it'll tell them a lot of great information, especially what's deficient and what's strong in what they're doing, and they just have to kind of prop up the things that aren't working, and magically things start happening for them in their business.
So it's businesssuccessfactors.com/checklist, right?
/checklist. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll download it as soon as it'll be a gift for myself from you. I appreciate
cool.
That'll be the
You're
second
welcome.
gift. Yeah. So thanks, Doug. Appreciate your time today. Hope you had fun, and I know I learned a lot. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Ramsey. And thank you, Benny. I really did have fun. This was a little bit different than I do an interview on, and the more you guys keep talking and asking, and the methodical component that you bring to this was very inviting. So if you ever want me back, please have me, because if your audience finds value in this, we can go deeper and deeper into subjects.
For sure. So for people listening, reach out to us on LinkedIn and let us know what you want us to ask Doug for the next session. So,
and go up and give this a 5-star review if you like it too.
That's right. Oh my God, we should hire you. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, Ramsey.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thanks, Doug, for coming on. We didn't say that who Doug is in the intro. We just said we had a great guest, and we never said who Doug is. So
it's true. Yeah, good point.
In case you're wondering, after the end of the show, our guest is Doug Brown. So
true. He did introduce himself.
He did introduce himself. It's not. Yeah, we always ask the guests to introduce themselves because we do some gaffes like this. But yeah, what did you think after the call?
I think it was great. I think it was really cool to kind of I guess get a sense as to how to objection handle in a human way, to kind of like always do things in the best interests of the customer that you're working with. And like, I guess whenever you're working a deal with that in mind, objection handling doesn't even like, it's not even as harsh a concept so much as just, clarifying to better help the customer, I guess.
It's understanding, like
Mhm.
why are they objecting? What's the reason behind it? And like I've witnessed this several times with when I'm jumping on calls with SEs where uh, instead of asking why the customer's saying what they're saying, they try to convince the customer. But and a lot of times, again, I think I said that on the show, a lot of times it's just they're saying the same thing, but because of language barrier or something, they need a translator. And if they just ask questions and try to understand, because that's happened to me while I'm on the call, I just asked the customer, like, did you mean that? It's like, oh yeah. All right, like, okay, yeah, that's no problem. Like, right, we're happy to help you with that. And it would have been like a minor objection. It's not even an objection, it's more of a question, which was
100%.
misunderstood. So just try to understand why they're objecting, try to understand what they're saying, and go from there, which, start by taking a deep breath.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I love that example. I know you mentioned a few times in the show as well, where your colleague was probably like with your colleague and the prospect were almost going down like two complete other paths, where even though like the intent or the answer to the prospect's question was a pretty simple answer that you had, just by clarifying, or I guess getting them to clarify exactly what their use case was. I guess if had you not intervened, just like the combativeness, I don't know if that's whatever that word is, of your colleague and the prospect around like, this is what you mean, right? Like, or
The worst part, like I'm sure nobody else was on the call, the worst part was the customer actually telling my colleagues, like, please understand what I'm saying.
right,
They
yeah,
literally said that,
fair.
right?
That
And
frustration rises.
yeah, so trying to handle objections isn't just about convincing, it's trying to understand. So I guess there's that. And it's more than just the business, right? The person we were working with for that specific scenario, his name is on the line. He's the end user who's going to make the decision if we should buy or not. Like, we already talked to the financial decision makers and all that, and they're okay to buy if the technical user gives the green light on the technology.
Right.
If so, it's like his name is on the line, right? If it comes down to that person's judgment, like, hey, you said buy it and now it doesn't work. So it's a stressful situation. And come to think of it, this is the first time I actually put two and two together, and to think about, like, it's his name on the line.
For sure.
Yeah.
No, it's really good. That's a good point.
Yeah. So pick up the book, Win-Win Selling: Unlocking Your Power for Profitability by Resolving Objections. It is a long title, but it's a good book. Chapter 9 is pretty good. So yeah.
Thank you, Doug, for coming on the show, and for the riveting discussion as per always.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug. Let's just sign off. This is Ramsey for Benny, who's wearing a hat and now his hair is looking weird. Kunungu. We'll see you guys later. Signing off. That's what I say.